There was a time before plagues had names, before disease became divinity, before the first spore of hopelessness settled into the heart of a dying child and found there not resistance, but recognition. I tell you this not as warning, but as record, not as condemnation, but as the slow accounting of how terror becomes theology. The Plague Father did not arrive in our galaxy fully formed, crowned in antlers of bone and trailing flies like a procession of dark stars. He grew. He accumulated. He became inevitable the way winter becomes inevitable, the way all gardens must eventually turn to mulch and memory. To understand Nurgle is to understand that decay was never the enemy of life, but its patient companion, walking just behind every breath, waiting with the kindness of certainty for the moment when all things surrender to their truest nature. This is his history. This is how the universe learned to love its own ending. In the beginning, there was no warp as we know it now. No churning sea of psychic energy divided into territories of rage and scheming and excess. There was only the immaterium, a mirror held up to real space, reflecting the thoughts and emotions of every living thing with cold fidelity. When the first microorganisms split and multiplied in the primordial seas of forgotten worlds, they knew nothing of philosophy or fear. They simply lived and died. But when the first sentient minds emerged, blinking into consciousness like newborns stumbling from the dark, they brought with them something the universe had never known. They brought awareness of their own fragility. They looked at their flesh and saw that it could be torn. They felt hunger and understood that it could go unfed. They watched their elders wither and recognized the shape of their own futures. And in that moment of terrible clarity, the immaterium shuddered. Something stirred in its depths, formless and patient. A coalescence of dread shaped like inevitability. It had no name yet. It had no voice, but it was listening. The first plagues were natural things. Viruses adapting to new hosts. Bacteria overwhelming immune systems not yet evolved to resist them. But sentient beings did not experience them as natural. They experienced them as punishment, as randomness, as the universe showing its teeth. Entire civilizations rose on worlds whose names are now less than dust. Cultures that built pyramids to their gods and temples to their ancestors. And when the fevers came, they prayed. They begged. They sacrificed. And in the warp, that ocean of thought made manifest. Their terror pulled like rainwater in a depression, gathering depth and weight. The thing that would become Nurgle did not yet have eyes, but it felt their despair. It tasted the particular flavor of suffering that comes not from violence, but from betrayal by one's own body, from watching strength turn to weakness, from the humiliation of flesh rebelling against will. And it grew larger, not quickly, not dramatically, but with the patience of rot working through wood, it grew. Millions of years passed. Civilizations bloomed and fell. The old ones walked between stars and seeded worlds with purpose, crafting species like artisans, shaping clay. But even they could not craft immunity to entropy. Even their great works carried within them the seeds of decline. Ecosystems they designed eventually found equilibrium through predation and disease. The elder rose in their first flowering, beautiful and vital, their emotions vivid enough to paint the warp in colors of passion and creativity. Yet even they knew sickness. Even they buried their dead and watched parents cradle dying children and felt the cold mathematics of population collapse when plagues swept through their settlements. Every funeral was a prayer. Every corpse was an offering. And in the depths of the immaterium, the gestating god of decay fed on their grief, growing more distinct with each century, acrewing something like personality from the accumulated weight of 10,000 trillion identical moments of loss. The war in heaven changed everything. When the Necroneer made their bargain with the Satan and became the Necrons, when the Old Ones responded by uplifting warrior races and weaponizing the warp itself, the galaxy became a furnace of suffering on a scale that had never before existed. Worlds burned. Populations were vaporized or enslaved. And in the wake of the great armies came something worse than weapons. Refugees carried diseases into new territories. Wounded soldiers festered in field hospitals that had no concept of sterilization. The dead were left to rot in trenches and craters, bloating under alien suns, leaking fluids into soil that would grow nothing for generations. The warp, already turbulent from the psychic screams of the dying, began to churn with new currents, and the thing that fed on despair and decay found itself glutted, swelling like a tumor fed by rich blood, taking on density and dimension. It began to dream, and its dreams were gardens. Imagine a place where nothing ever truly dies, where every corpse becomes compost for new growth, where fungi bloom in eye sockets and beetles make homes in hollowed rib cages, where the cycle of decay and renewal spins endlessly without the interruption of sanitization or fire. This was the first vision of the Garden of Nurgle, not yet a true domain, but a psychic landscape taking shape in the deepest currents of the warp. It was not born from malice. That is the terrible truth. It was born from the acceptance that all things end, that all flesh is temporary, that the only constant in the universe is the breaking down of complexity into simplicity. And for those who suffered without hope of recovery, for those who watched their bodies fail and their strength fade, there was something almost comforting in that vision. A promise that their suffering had meaning, that their decay was part of a greater cycle, that they would be welcomed into the garden and allowed to rest, to become part of something larger than their individual pain. The first demons of Nurgle were not the plague bearers we know now. They were simpler things, psychic constructs given form by the concentrated dread of entire populations facing extinction. They appeared as shadows in sick rooms, as figures glimpsed in fever dreams, as the feeling of presence that settles over a deathbed just before the final breath. They did not attack. They did not threaten. They simply waited. And their waiting had weight. It pressed down on the living like humidity before a storm, making every breath feel labored, every movement exhausting. Those who saw them reported a strange relief, a sense that resistance was futile, and therefore the burden of struggle could finally be set down. Entire hospital wards would fall silent as the proto-ammons moved through them, and by morning, every patient would be dead, their faces slack with something that resembled peace. The survivors called it mercy. The warp called it sacrament. The prehistory of Nurgle is written in the extinction events of 1,000 forgotten species. Each mass death added to his substance. Each pandemic another layer of psychic sediment compressed into the foundation of his being. There were races whose names exist now only in the genetic memory of their successor species. Civilizations that rose to heights of cultural and technological achievement only to be felled by pathogens so virulent that their entire population collapsed within a single generation. The archaeological record of these dead worlds tells the same story again and again. Cities abandoned mid-construction, tools left where they fell, skeletal remains piled in makeshift mass graves that no one survived to properly consecrate. And in each case, the final phase of the civilization showed the same pattern. Religious fervor increasing, temples being built or repurposed for new deities whose iconography centered on cycles and renewal and acceptance of death, cults forming that preached surrender to the inevitable. The psychic imprint of these death cults fed directly into the growing consciousness that would become Nurgle, teaching it the languages of despair, the rituals of submission, the prayers that the hopeless whisper when all other gods have proven deaf. On a world whose coordinates have been expuned from all imperial records, there once existed a species of amphibious bipeds who achieved a form of civilization remarkably advanced for their evolutionary stage. They built cities on the shores of warm seas, developed mathematics and astronomy, created art that expressed concepts of beauty and transcendence. But their biology made them vulnerable to fungal infections. And when a mutation arose in one of the native fungal species, turning it from benign symbiote to virulent parasite, their civilization collapsed in less than a standard year. The fungus spread through their population with terrifying efficiency, growing in their respiratory systems, sending fruiting bodies erupting through their skin, eventually consuming them from within while keeping them alive and ambulatory for weeks. The infected wandered in a daze, spreading spores with every breath, and the healthy fled into the deep ocean or high mountains, anywhere the fungus could not reach. But the fungus was patient. It evolved. It learned to survive in salt water, to tolerate cold, to lie dormant for years, waiting for a host. And one by one, the survivors were found and infected, until the last member of the species died, choking on mycelia in a cave high in the mountains, alone and afraid, and wondering what they had done to deserve such a fate. Nothing. They had done nothing. That was the lesson the warp learned from their extinction. Suffering is not punishment. It is not earned. It simply is a fundamental property of existence, as inevitable as gravity. And from that realization, Nurgle drew his first true emotion. Not malice, not hatred, but pity. Deep, abiding, paternal pity for all living things cursed with the awareness of their own mortality. He would have saved them if he could, but salvation is not in his nature. He can only offer comfort in the acceptance of what cannot be changed. And so the amphibians died, and their psychic death scream added to his growing essence. And he mourned them in the way a gardener mourns a failed crop with regret, but also with the understanding that failure is part of the process, and the soil enriched by their decay will nourish the next planting. Then came the fall. The Eldar Empire in its decadent zenith had grown so consumed by sensation and excess that their collective psychic emanations birthed Slaanesh, the youngest and most violent of the Chaos Gods. The psychic scream of she who thirsts tore through the warp like a blade through silk, and in the aftermath, the immaterium was forever changed. The four great powers solidified into true divinity. K, who had just estated on aeons of warfare and murder, took his throne of skulls. Scene, born from ambition and scheming, claimed his crystal labyrinth. Slaanesh, newborn but voracious, carved out domains of impossible pleasure and exquisite pain. And Nurgle, eldest of the four in the slow accumulation of his essence, finally opened his eyes in his garden and laughed. It was not a cruel laugh. It was the chuckle of a grandfather watching children play, warm and indulgent, and utterly devoid of malice. He had been waiting so long, and now, at last, the universe was ready to understand what he offered. His garden expanded in that moment of cosmic restructuring. Where before it had been a vague psychic landscape, it now became a true realm within the warp, vast beyond measurement and teeming with a grotesque vitality that mocked every natural law. Trees grew there with bark like diseased flesh, their branches heavy with fruits that wept pus and honey in equal measure. Rivers flowed thick with bile and swarmed with microscopic life forms that had never existed in real space, each one a unique expression of decay's creative potential. The sky, if it could be called a sky, hung low and green with perpetual fog, and through that fog drifted spores the size of houses, drifting on currents of flatulent wind that carried the smell of compost and gangrene and strangely fresh earth after rain. Nurglings tumbled through the undergrowth, giggling as they gnawed on rotting logs and each other, their tiny bodies regenerating as quickly as they were damaged. And at the center of it all, in a man's built from calcified bone and living wood, Nurgle himself took his true form for the first time. Massive, bloated, fatherly, his skin was the color of old bruises. His belly distended with the accumulated diseases of a million worlds. Antlers sprouted from his skull, wreathed in flies that sang his praises in the key of decay.